In this video, we will show you how to replace your vehicle's intake manifold gasket set on the Chevy Silverado with a 4.3-liter engine. These are the gaskets for your engine, so they're located in your engine compartment. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. Before we start removing anything, we have to make sure that we relieve fuel pressure from the system. Let's open up the fuse panel cover. Looking on the inside, we're looking for an area that says fuel pump. I have it marked in pink right here. This will be the relay that we're going to remove. Let's make sure we have it in the proper positioning so we know exactly which relay to remove. Go ahead and take hold of that and pull it out of place. Once you've done so, we can go ahead and attempt to start the vehicle. You may find that it starts and stalls out, or it just doesn't start at all. Either way, it's a good sign. Quick inspection, make sure we don't have any damage or corrosion. Let's try again. Perfect. Once you've completed this action, we'll continue on with reinstalling the relay into its original position. Press it in, make sure it's completely secured, and protect the area. Let's move from there directly forward to the negative battery terminal. We'll be using an 8mm to dislodge this and set it aside so it's making no contact. Now it's time to drain the coolant. We have to make our way over to the reservoir. When you open this, make sure it's not under pressure and lift it up away from your face. A quick inspection of that cap itself to ensure that it's in good working order, and we'll set that aside. At this point, we'll start draining the coolant. It's a good idea to have a collection receptacle under this area so you can collect and recycle that fluid properly. If you were to move down along the passenger side of the radiator, you're going to find the point where the lower hose connects to the radiator. This is where we'll be draining it from. When you do go to drain it, coolant will make its way across the crossmember and potentially across the other side of the front of the vehicle. Make sure you have a collection receptacle handy. We'll use some hose pliers for this. Squeeze the clamp, slide it out of the way, and slide the hose off of the radiator. Try to control that coolant coming out into your collection receptacle. We'll let this finish draining. Once the coolant's drained, go ahead and reattach your lower hose. We'll slide that all the way up against the radiator and reinstall the clamp into its original position. A quick inspection, make sure it's secure. Once you feel as though you have the clamp in the proper position, you need to give it a quick inspection and ensure you can see hose on both sides of the clamp. Clearly, we can see it on the side that leads over to the engine, but you do need to see at least a little bit on the side that's closest to the radiator. The next thing we have to do is have our engine on top dead center. That will be easiest to do if you remove the fan shroud from the area. For the fan shroud itself, it's going to have 4 push clips, 2 along each side. To remove your push clips, you carefully start pulling out the center to unlock it, and then you remove the outer portion as well to fully remove it. A quick inspection set it aside. Let's get this next one here. Okay, that's this side of the vehicle. Let's do the exact same thing on the other side of the shroud, and then we'll continue with our 2 10mm headed bolts. Next one. Let's get these 10mm bolts out of here. Take hold of this, carefully lift it up, being careful not to cause any damage to your radiator located along the front of this. A quick inspection and we'll set it aside. To remove the lower portion of this shroud, go ahead and take hold of it and roll it up and out of the way, once again paying attention to that radiator. The next thing we'll have to do is align our timing marks on the crank pulley itself and the engine. Now I already have these marked off. The areas that need to align, you have the blue areas along the top here, and then down along the bottom, I've also marked that position. Typically these won't be properly aligned. You're going to have to turn the crank with a 16mm clockwise until they are. We want to make sure the engine's on top dead center on cylinder 1 on the compression stroke. The way you can tell it's on the compression stroke is because the engine will get harder to turn over. We'll make our way right down here, find that center mounting bolt, and now we'll start turning this clockwise, only clockwise. Right now it's fairly easy to turn. It's getting a little harder. I can feel it wants to turn back as soon as I release. Now it's easy again. Let's pay attention to those alignment marks. So right there, I just saw the yellow go by. That yellow one is the first marking, which will align down at the bottom there. As we bring this down to its alignment point down there, we should also see the blue marking make its way around as well. And there's the blue marking right there. You want to make sure you have it as close to aligned as possible while on the compression stroke on cylinder 1. In this area, we'll be loosening this clamp with an 8mm or flathead screwdriver. You don't need to completely dislodge it, you just need to have a little bit of movement here. Go ahead and separate this. A quick inspection of each part, and we'll continue on just behind that. Take hold of this hose, give it a little wiggle, and slide it off. Make sure that's soft and pliable. In this area, you're going to find a plastic wing nut. Turn this counterclockwise and remove it. Now we can take hold of this and carefully start lifting it up and off of here. Go ahead and set that aside. Continuing on, we'll make sure that we cover the port leading into the engine. Once you know exactly where each one of the spark plug wires goes to, we'll continue on to removing them from the distributor cap. You can start on whichever side you'd like. I'll be over on the passenger side, starting along the rear with that coil wire. As you remove each and every one of these, give them a close inspection. If you see any funny colors, it's corrosion and it needs to be dealt with. There we are. We'll set all these aside and do the exact same thing on the other side of the distributor cap. Now we can start removing the distributor cap from the area. The distributor cap is held in place with two T20 screws. There's one along the back side, and there's one along the front side of the distributor cap. Go ahead and loosen up each of these, and then we'll remove the cap from the area. All right, that one's nice and loose. We'll do the exact same thing to the forward bolt. Let's get the cap out of here. We'll just give this a quick inspection and set it aside. With the cap out of the way, we'll continue on with our electrical connector. For this, you just want to go ahead and lift up on that locking tab, pull it out of place, and give it a quick inspection. Once again, we're looking for corrosion. That would be a bad sign. Let's pause back there. We'll make our way over here. We need to disconnect this evap line. To disconnect it, looking at it, you can see on the connector, it has a white tab. Go ahead and depress that and slide this out of position. A quick inspection of the line and set it aside. We need to have a whole bunch of slack along the backside of that distributor. To press this in, you can use a small pick, screwdriver, whatever you might happen to have. That looks good. We'll just bring this up inside this area here. There we are. Now, before we can remove the distributor, it's important to make two markings. The first marking that we want to pay attention to, we're going to be locating this tab right along here, which is where your electrical current will go through, and you want to mark on the distributor base exactly where it lines up with. The angle of the camera right here makes it look like it's a little bit off, but realistically, if you were to look straight down at it, you're going to find that it makes its way straight down to this portion of the base. Really don't have to make too much of a marking, but I'll do it just for good measure. Once you have the rotor marked in comparison to the base, the next thing that we have to do is mark the base of the distributor in comparison to the engine. On this particular distributor, you don't necessarily have to make this marking because the lockdown clip is adhered to the distributor itself. But commonly you do make this marking, so we're going to do it for good measure. In this case, we'll be working along the back side of the distributor, over on the driver's side there. It's easier to make a mark. With the distributor properly marked, we'll continue on with removing the one 10mm headed bolt that holds the distributor down to the engine. That's going to be located along the passenger side of the distributor. You can see the bolt right here. To gain access to this, you may have to use a ratcheting wrench. I'll just make my way right back here. There's our mounting bolt. A quick inspection and we'll set this aside. You will be reusing it. Now that we have the mounting hardware out of there, take hold of the distributor base. We're going to start lifting this straight up and out of the engine. As you do so, you're going to find that the center portion here, the rotor of the distributor, is going to start to spin on you. It's important to make sure that once you start lifting this up, watching it spin, as soon as it stops spinning, make sure you mark the base of the distributor exactly where the electrode faces to, just like we did before. I'm going to make the marking in a separate color. I can see that starting to pivot here. Nice and easy. As I was lifting it up, I could see it pivoting and then it stopped. As I mentioned, we're going to make sure we mark the base of the distributor in this spot before we continue lifting it up and out. All right, let's get this out of here. A quick inspection and we'll set this aside. Now we can start removing some things from across the top of the engine, starting with this bracket across the front here. Now we don't necessarily have to dislodge each of these two wiring harnesses, but the one that you do want to dislodge is the one that leads over to the alternator. We don't have to disconnect it from the alternator, we just want to dislodge it from this bracket area. Now that we have that dislodged, we can start removing the bracket. For the bracket, you'll find that it's held in place with two 10mm headed nuts. There's one over here and one just on the side of that throttle body. Now we can maneuver the bracket around. You're going to find that the bracket also has your throttle cable attached to it. If we were to follow that throttle cable, you'll see that it makes its way along the passenger side of the throttle body, loops around this area, and connects in on the far port along the passenger side rear. To remove the cable from this area, you can take hold of this valve, give it a little twist. That's going to cause some slack on that throttle cable. With the slack on the cable, we'll go ahead and pull that right out of place, give it a quick inspection, and set it aside for now. Slide it right out. Double check to make sure your throttle cable is not damaged, frayed, or anything the like. This one looks fine. With the cable detached, let's continue on with removing the bracket. This is held in place with 3 pieces of 10mm mounting hardware, 2 studs, and 1 nut. You have 1 mounting nut over here. The second one will be located along the front of the throttle body. Slide this out of here. At this point, we can pull everything aside as needed. Nice. After moving the brackets, we'll continue on with the electrical connectors along the driver's side of the throttle body. Each of these will have a small locking tab. Just go ahead and pull that away from the connector. Disconnect it, a quick inspection, and set it aside. Nice. Moving from those 2 electrical connectors, let's follow the wiring harness over to where it connects to the fuel injector, right up along the top here. This does have a locking tab. You can see the strap for it. We'll just make our way underneath, pry it up, a quick inspection of that locking tab. Now just behind that, you're going to find that you have a locking tab right here. And then all the way on the other side, underneath this portion of the wiring harness, there's a second one. This one's a little bit more difficult to gain access to. I'll be using an angled pick. Make my way under, take hold of that. On this side, same thing, and gently lift it up and out of place. If the cover pops off, that's okay. You can just reseat that. Slide that on now while we're here. Listen for a click from all 4 corners there. A quick inspection for corrosion as always. And we'll set this aside. Let's make our way over here to the map sensor. Quick disconnection. Continuing on, we have this red connector. Set that wiring aside. Now we'll continue on to removing this. Before you can remove it, you have to remove the bracket side first. Along the backside there, you do have a 10mm headed mounting nut that holds the bracket down. Remove the nut, remove the bracket. After that, we'll continue on with our 10mm to remove each of these 10mm studs. 10mm here. Let's take hold of the bracket. We'll lift it up and out of here. Let's go ahead and set that aside for now. Let's get these studs out of here. These 2 studs do also hold the upper intake to the lower intake. It's important to make sure that they are in good working order. Let's take hold of this. We'll give it a little wiggle and lift it up and out of place. Once again, setting it aside. That looks good. We can see that the harness makes its way across this bracket as well. We actually have to remove the entire bracket from across the top of the upper intake. So we'll be removing the 2 10mm headed mounting nuts holding it down. Take hold of the bracket and set that aside. Moving forward from that area, we have a PCV tube which leads down to here. Go ahead and take hold of the hose portion right at the bend and give it a little tug, lifting it up and off of there. A quick inspection to make sure it is still soft and pliable and not torn, worn, or damaged. There we are. You can remove that whole thing. If the PCV valve comes out of the valve cover, just go ahead and give it a quick inspection. It only makes sense. If it has to be replaced, pull it off of the hose and replace it. This one looks fine. Continuing with hoses, looking along this area here, close to where the fuel injector wiring harness was, we're going to squeeze on the 3 ears of this clamp, slide it out of the way, and remove that hose. You can use some pliers for this. As you can tell, this clamp is in very poor condition. We'll be replacing it. Take hold of the hose, give it a wiggle, and see if you can remove it. If you have a hard time sliding it off of there, you may have to use a hose pick to break it free. Be careful not to cause any damage to your rubber hose. That looks good. Now, if you were to follow the fuel lines along the backside of the engine, it's a little bit difficult to see, but there's a 10mm bolt holding this bracket down. We'll remove that bolt. Now with that broken free, let's follow those fuel lines up to the top of the upper intake. At this point, we're going to be opening up the fuel system. It's important to make sure that you're in a well-ventilated area while doing so, and make sure that no fuel gets on your hands or in your eyes. At this point, I'm going to turn on my fan. It might be a little bit harder to hear me. Continuing on, since this will be opened and fuel vapors will be in the air, you cannot use any electric type tools. They can cause a spark. We'll use an 8mm for each one of the 2 mounting nuts across the top here. I already have penetrant on, so it hopefully doesn't break either of the studs. Just work both of these back and forth. This one, it looks like the stud's coming up with it. You can separate that on the bench. We'll have a quick look at that bracket. I'm going to have to clean it up, give it a close inspection. If it looks like it's rotted and weak, you have to go ahead and replace this. When we go to lift these up, it is possible there could be some fuel still in the system. Be extremely careful. It's also a good idea to have some plugs that you could slide over the fuel lines to help prevent fuel vapors from making their way out of the lines while you continue. Looks like I got one of them coming up now. Just a little bit of a tight fit. There's one. Nice. Just lift up on these. Like I said, we're going to cover each one of the line ports. At this point, I'm just going to remove as much fuel from along the top area here as possible to help reduce the fuel vapors. We'll make sure that we dispose of this rag properly. As I mentioned, we will not use any electrical tools anytime that the fuel system is open. Let's continue on to removing the throttle body from the area, starting with this center point here. Use a 5.5mm socket to remove this stud. That looks good. The throttle body's also held down with 2 10mm headed mounting studs. Those are along the front. Remove the pair. Take hold of the throttle body and lift it up and away from your upper intake. You want to make sure that you protect that port so nothing falls inside of your engine. Let's continue removing the rest of the mounting hardware, holding the upper intake to the lower intake. On this, you're going to find that you have 4 mounting studs out in the open. There's 3 along the driver's side and 1 all the way over on the passenger side. The other 2 are going to be located along the back side. They're a little bit harder to get to, but really not too bad. Got all those out. Let's make our way back here now. At this point, we can take hold of this and wiggle it around, but you're going to find that it's stuck in place because of the fuel injector in this area. We'll use a flathead screwdriver or a small prying device and carefully make our way in between the upper intake and the fuel injector and gently pry it, being extremely careful not to cause any damage. Just wiggle it around as we continue here. Nice. Now we'll have to lift this up and out of here. We'll give it a close inspection and set it aside for now. With the cover out of the way, let's continue on along this area. We're going to disconnect the power wire from along the back side of the alternator. Use a 10mm for this. We'll just turn this counterclockwise, remove that mounting nut, give everything a quick inspection, and set the wiring aside. Just double check to make sure there's no corrosion here. This looks good. Let's continue on to this coolant hose right along here. Squeeze the clamp, slide it out of place. We'll use some pliers. A little hose pick to break this free, being careful not to cause any damage to the hose. We are reusing this, of course. Quick inspection of that hose. Set that aside. Let's move along to the upper coolant hose, which leads to the tube over to the thermostat. Of course, you could remove the top thermostat housing from this area, but then it's a good idea to replace the gasket. If you don't have the gasket, just go ahead and remove the hose. When removing this, you want to be careful in case there is any coolant inside of this hose. We don't want it to fall into the engine. Set that aside. Now let's move along to this coolant hose. We're going to have to break free the bracket that holds this tube in place. Use a 13mm. Remove the hose from the tube. We'll have to squeeze the clamp and slide it out of place. We'll take this coolant tube and slide it off to the side, out of our way. Now moving just below that area, we have another coolant hose that leads down to the intake. Go ahead and squeeze the clamp and then slide the hose out of place as well. This one's a little bit more difficult to gain access to. we are. Moving along, we'll remove the two 10mm headed studs that hold the ignition coil bracket down. Take this and set it aside. Making our way to the back side of the intake, we have our oil pressure switch. We don't have to remove the switch itself. We can just disconnect the connector. It has a small locking tab. You just want to pull that away, a quick inspection for corrosion, and set the wiring aside for now. Now let's move over towards the passenger side here. You can see that there is a bracket with a wiring harness. We'll pop the wiring harness free, and then you're going to find that you have a mounting bolt holding this bracket in place. You can use a trim tool for this or a small prying device. Get that out of the way. Use a 14mm to remove this. There we are. Now once you have that nut off of there, you're going to find that you do have a ground wire. It's important to make sure that you give that a close inspection. You will be reusing it. Set it aside in an area that you will be able to find it. Just push that right back there. Now we'll continue on with removing the rest of this stud here, which is holding the bracket in place. We'll use a 15mm for this stud. You don't have to fully remove this stud, but it is a good idea to have plenty of room from the bracket. It's just good measure. We'll set this aside. Now we're going to have to remove the serpentine belt to continue the job. Before you start removing it, pay attention to the routing. You'll find that it goes over some pulleys and under others. Once you have note of that, we'll be paying attention down on the corner here. We're looking for the tensioner. Use a 3/8 drive ratchet or serpentine belt tool. Turn this counterclockwise to release tension from the belt. Slide the belt off of the idler pulley, remove your tool. At this point, we can go ahead and remove the belt from the area. A quick inspection of your belt, make sure it is still reusable. If it looks like it's worn, torn, or damaged, go ahead and replace it. This one looks fine, we'll set it aside. Now we're going to gain focus on this area here. We're going to have to remove this forward bracket and slide it to the front so we can gain access to the mounting points for the lower intake. We'll start with this electrical connector up along the top of the AC compressor. This has two locking tabs. Just go ahead and use a small screwdriver and pry those locking tabs away, a quick inspection, and set it aside. We'll move along to the next electrical connector up along the top here. Once again, just go ahead and pop that out of place. Now, so we can have a little bit more access with this area, we'll just break this free as well. We can take this entire bracket and slide it towards the driver's side. Do the same thing with the wiring harness. Continue on to your four 15mm headed mounting bolts that hold the AC compressor down to the bracket. Once you have those removed, we'll take the AC compressor and slide it over towards the passenger side of the vehicle, out of the way. Now we'll rest this aside. With the AC compressor out of the way, we'll remove this 13mm headed bolt holding the bracket in place. Just going to start this back on here a couple threads. Now we can start dislodging the bracket from the engine. We're not going to start along the front. Let's make our way along the back side of the power steering pump. Now this is going to be a little bit difficult to see, but looking along the back side of the power steering pump assembly and in between the exhaust manifolds, you can see this 14mm headed mounting nut. Now for that nut, we're going to loosen it up, but you don't have to fully remove it. We just want to have it nice and loose and still on there a couple threads. Okay, as you can tell, we have plenty of slack in this area. Let's continue along the front area of this bracket. If you were to look just underneath the power steering pump pulley, you're going to find one of your 14mm headed mounting bolts. Go ahead and fully remove that, a quick inspection, and set it aside. While we're down here, let's go ahead and remove this piece of mounting hardware right here. Along the front, we have two 14mm mounting bolts and one mounting nut. Let's start by loosening that mounting nut and then starting it back on just a couple threads. Quick inspection there, that looks good. Now we'll continue on to removing that mounting nut here. Continue drawing this away. You don't need to fully remove this. We only need to gain access to that forward mounting bolt down in this area. If you do need to remove it, gently rest it down, putting no pressure on your power steering lines. Before you continue removing the mounting bolts that hold the lower intake down to the engine, it's important to make sure that you try to clean out as much of the debris along where the intake connects to the engine as possible. That way there, we can reduce the amount of debris falling into the engine. Now starting to remove these bolts, you're going to find that you have several 13mm headed mounting bolts. We have some across the front here, making their way down to the side and over to the back, all the way across. Let's start this removal process. Now we can make our way towards those rear bolts. There's 4 of them back here. This one on the far rear here. With all the mounting bolts out of there, we're going to take hold of this area and gently start lifting up on this, rocking it free from the lower portion of the engine. Once again, we need to ensure that nothing falls inside of the engine through this process. Here we are. Nice. We'll be careful for our fuel lines here. Just keep on lifting this up and out of the engine compartment. If it feels like it's stuck, it's possible the gaskets are holding it in place. It's common. We'll set this aside. With the intake out of the way, we have a clear view of our lower intake gaskets. You can see that there's still a whole bunch of debris along this area. We'll make sure that we try to remove as much of this as possible while we remove the gasket. Once we have the gasket out of place, we'll give the engine a close inspection. Okay. If you need to, you could carefully use a scraper to start removing the gaskets. As you can see, the gasket will come across the front, all the way over to the other side, and then down around the back as well. We'll just use a scraper and start gently scraping this away, once again making sure that nothing falls inside the engine. All right. There it is, friend. With this area covered, we'll be continuing with a scraper and a rag, some parts cleaner directly on the rag, and go ahead and clean down the mating surface. Just make our way all the way around this, making sure that it's a smooth mating surface. While you make your way around, there's 4 places that you need to pay special attention to. The areas where the heads of the engine connect to the core of the engine here. You can see that there's a small gap right here. I'll make my way over on the other side along the front where the other head connects on. And then you have the same exact thing on the rear of the engine. Make sure that those areas are scraped clean and of course cleaned up with that parts cleaner directly from the rag. Get everything scraped down. One quick wipe here just to ensure that everything is smooth. This is extremely important. You don't want to have a vacuum leak. That will cause a running condition. Once again, pay special attention to each of those 4 corners. They need to be dry with no oily surface. Clean that up with our parts cleaner right there. Once you have that area cleaned, we'll carefully start taking out these rags, trying to reduce the amount of debris falling into the engine. Ensure that nothing is inside the engine. Now let's make our way over to the bench and start cleaning up that intake. Let's start along the bottom of the intake. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of miscellaneous debris. We'll go ahead and clean up the mating surface along one side, making our way all the way across the front once again, over the other side, and along the rear. After we've done that, we'll continue on along the top, cleaning that as well. I've got my scraper. While we're doing this, let's try to lean it away so no debris falls inside the ports. Along the corners here, and on the far side is the corners that I was telling you about on the engine block itself. It's common to have some gasket maker in these 4 areas. It might require a little extra scraping. Get this side all scraped down. Quick wipe here with our parts cleaner on the rag. Looks pretty good. We'll focus down along here a little bit more and make our way across. Let's give the lower portion one last quick inspection over here, and we'll turn this over and complete the process along the top. Make our way all the way across this upper mounting point here. This doesn't look too bad at all, really. Quick wipe with our parts cleaner on the rag. Once you've completed that, make your way to where the distributor would be mounted along the back side of the intake. A quick confirmation that there's no debris anywhere where it could get into the engine, and now we can get back over to the vehicle. Now back over at the engine, you're going to be using some of the gasket maker that came in your kit. This part is extremely important. You're going to have to make a good seal, otherwise you'll have a vacuum leak. The areas that you'll be using the gasket maker is along each of those 4 corners that I talked about, but you're also going from each corner all the way across the front or the rear, depending on where you're at, to the other corner there. So we'll have a steady bead all the way across the front and all the way across the back, including each of those 4 corners. You don't need very much here, but you do want to have a good seal. As I make my way to each one of the corners, you'll find that I also make my way up each one of the sides just a little bit. There's the front. Let's do the same to the rear. You can smooth it out with a gloved finger, making sure that you do have a good amount making its way all the way across all of these areas. Then we'll continue on with our side gaskets. Now it's time for our side gaskets. Pay close attention to these. On one side of them, you'll find that it's a smooth surface, but if you were to turn it over, on the opposite side, you're going to find that you have 2 locating tabs. Those tabs are important to note, and they need to fit into the engine block. You can see one port here and one towards the rear. It's the exact same thing on each side of the engine. Let's take this and rest it in position, aligning those ports. Go ahead and press it right on there. Once you have that held in place, do the exact same thing on the other side of the engine. Double check to make sure they cannot shift around. Now let's pay attention to those 4 corners again. We'll be using that gasket maker. For this, we're going to make our way right up along the top of the gaskets. We don't need to come too far, but we just want to make a nice lip on each one of these 4 corners. There's the front, same for the rear. The next thing we need to do is prepare to install the intake, but before you do, you want to make sure that you clean the threads on each one of the 8 mounting bolts. As we bring the intake into position, be extremely careful not to disrupt your gaskets or that gasket maker. With this rested in position, it's time for all 8 of our mounting bolts. Now we're going to start each of them in by hand. When we go to snug them up, we're going to do it in a very specific order and also make sure that we torque them as well. There's 3 passes for the torque sequence on this. Let's get these rear bolts in here. Now with each of these bolts started in here, we can snug them down in the specific sequence. The first time around, we'll be torquing them to 27 inch-pounds. It's not very much. We don't want to cause any damage to the gasket. Just bottom that out. There's that. Now we're going to move diagonally, essentially making our way to the center bolts first, and then moving outward. Okay. Now we'll make our way to the last corner here in the center. Continuing on, we'll make our way to the far rear corner on the passenger side here. Go ahead and bottom that out. Let's make our way to the driver's side. Now we'll make our way over to the front driver's side. Now for the second pass, we're going to repeat the same exact sequence, starting from the center, making our way diagonally each four corner, and then back out towards the outer four corners. For this time, we're going to be torquing it to 106 inch-pounds. Let's torque this to 106 inch-pounds. Passenger side front now. Over to the driver's side front. Now it's time for our third pass. For the third pass, we'll be torquing these in the same sequence once again, this time to 11 foot-pounds. At this point, the lower intake is completely torqued down. It's time to reinstall this bracket here. We're going to lift it and slide it into position along the engine. When it is in position, we should be able to see the forward stud slide through the bracket, and we'll start that mounting nut on. Let's get these bolts in here. Once again, we're just starting everything in. We can snug it up later. Let's get this one in down here. Now we also have the mounting nut down in this area. It goes to this bracket right here. There is, of course, one more mounting nut, and that's on the back side of the power steering bracket. We already have that started on there, and we did not fully remove it. At this point, let's continue on to snugging up our mounting hardware, starting with the mounting bolts and the nuts across the front. We'll bottom these out and then torque each of them to 30 foot-pounds. At this point, we have all of the forward mounting hardware tightened. We'll continue on along the back side of the power steering pump, in between the power steering pump reservoir and the manifold. Make our way back here. We'll torque this to 30 foot-pounds as well. Now we can prepare to install our AC compressor across the top. We'll remove our mounting bolt for now, set that aside. Take that compressor rested in position. Start in each of your 4 mounting bolts, snug them up, and torque those to 37 foot-pounds. get this bracket in place. We'll start in our 13mm headed mounting bolt. For this one, you can just go ahead and snug it up. Now we can continue with some coolant hoses across the front here while we still have some space. Take this one, slide it in just below that thermostat housing. You do want to make sure that you have it pressed on as far as possible. Take that clamp and put it back in its original position. Ensure that you can see hose on both sides of the clamp and give it a light tug to make sure it's completely secured. Now we can grab this coolant tube. We're going to get this in position as well. For this, we do have that mounting bracket that'll bolt in right along here. Before we go ahead and put that in though, let's reattach the hose. Go ahead and slide it right in there. You can see that I do have it bottomed out as it needs to be. We'll take that clamp and slide it over here. You can see hose on both sides. Let's get that mounting bolt in there. Start it in, snug it up. Get that bolt in there, snug it up. Let's continue on with this coolant tube across here. Slide that right on there. Now it's time for the serpentine belt. When we go to install this, you want to make sure you have it in the same exact orientation as when you had removed it. You remember it went over some pulleys and under others. We'll take the belt, bring it down along the passenger side of the water pump pulley, and bring it around the crank pulley, which is the bottom pulley on the engine. Now we can take the backing of the belt and bring it around that water pump pulley. That's the flat side. Continue on around the water pump pulley to that power steering pump down along the bottom driver's side, and then up along the AC compressor. Now let's continue on along the passenger side. We'll be taking the belt from the crank, around the tensioner, around the alternator, and then we're going to start applying pressure, bringing it down towards the idler pulley here. Continue on with your 3/8 drive ratchet, turn that tensioner counterclockwise to release tension. Slide the belt underneath the idler pulley. Pause. Let's take a quick inspection here. We need to double check to make sure we're completely seated around each one of the pulleys. If you're off by even one tooth on the serpentine belt, you're going to cause damage to the belt and potentially other damage as well. It's worth a second look. Now let's get the upper radiator hose in place. Once again, there could be coolant inside of this hose. You want to be extremely careful not to let anything fall inside the engine. There we are. Let's get the ignition coil bracket in place. We'll start in each of our 10mm headed mounting studs here. Go. Double check to make sure that's completely secured in place. Let's bring the alternator power wire across here. Move the boot out of the way. If it looks like there's any corrosion, you definitely want to make sure that you clean it up. Give it a quick scuffing with some sandpaper if necessary. Once you've done so, continue on with your 10mm headed mounting nut. We'll start this on there and snug it up. We'll torque this to 80 inch-pounds. Make sure you protect this area with your protective boot. You don't want anything grounding out against this area. Get these connectors on here. There's that one in. This one on the far side. Let's continue on with our bracket, aligning our wiring harnesses, and latch them in. Press that one in. This one on there. Let's make our way to the back side of the intake. We have this bracket that we do need to install. Go ahead and put it in position, start in your mounting bolt and snug it up. Okay, I've got that started in there. Let's make sure this is nice and snug. Once you do have that bottomed out, we'll continue on with the ground wire. Take that, put it in position, and install the mounting nut. Put this on here. There we are. It's nice and tight. We'll give it a wiggle to double check to make sure it is properly secured. Feels good. Moving from there, we'll continue on to our oil pressure switch sensor connector here. Press it in, listen for a click. We'll give that a little tug to make sure it's completely secured in place. Let's prepare our upper intake now. Looking along the bottom side of it, we have the intake gasket making its way all the way around. Go ahead and pry that out of place using a pocket screwdriver or a small pick. A quick inspection of the channel making its way all the way around. You want to make sure nothing's cracked or broken in any way. We'll also clean this down with some parts cleaner and prepare to install our brand new gasket. Now to install the gasket, you want to make sure you have it in the proper placement. We'll align it and then gently press it in, making sure that it's completely seated all the way around. If it's off by even one part, it's going to cause a vacuum issue. You're going to have a running condition and a check engine light. The lower portion looks great. Let's continue on the upper portion here. We'll pop this out of place. Install that gasket. Once again, I'll properly aligning it and pressing it in. With those gaskets in place, let's continue on along right here. We're going to have to take this and turn it clockwise to dislodge it from its locked position. Just take hold, give it a little twist. It's going to want to stop. At that point, you should be able to lift it straight up and away from the cover. Along the bottom of this is where you're going to find your gasket. Go ahead and carefully remove that. Give the area a close inspection. If it looks like it's dry rotted and cracked, that's going to be an issue. Install your brand new seal. We'll take this and carefully stretch it right on over this area. Once it's in position, we can reinstall this into the cover. Now when we go to install this, we're going to be turning it counterclockwise. We'll press this down into position. If it feels like it's a little tight, you can lubricate it with some clean motor oil if necessary. Turn that counterclockwise until it's in the completely locked position, and now we can get this over to the vehicle. Let's make our way over to the fuel injector here. Carefully remove the gasket. You want to be careful not to cause any damage to the fuel injector unit itself. Just pull this right off of here. A quick inspection of that seal and set it aside. Let's get our new seal on there. Looking at the fuel injector itself, you can see exactly where it's supposed to sit. Make sure it's seated properly. If it's off by even a small amount, you can cause a serious issue. Just double check all the way around here. Continue on applying a thin amount of clean motor oil directly around that seal. Make sure it's well lubricated here. Let's install our upper intake cover here. Before we do, we'll make sure that we unplug the lines here. Slide those right out of place. There could still be fuel left in those lines. You want to be extremely careful. Now we'll take the intake and rest it in position. Once we have everything properly aligned, you can start in the mounting studs. Don't snug any of them up yet. When you go to slide this in position, you're going to find that you have a little bit of a difficult time along the top of the fuel injector gasket. That's what the lubricant's for. Just carefully continue pressing it down. At this point, we'll be focusing in the center. As we continue bringing this down, we need to make sure that the fuel injector unit pops up into the lock position. The fuel injector itself does have 4 locking tabs, 2 along each side. Carefully take hold of the fuel injector and give it a loving tug up as you press the rest of the intake cover down. There we are. It's getting close now. We'll just continue on carefully with some pliers. Take hold of this area and give it a little tug. You may find when putting on the cover, the fuel injector unit just does not want to go up into the locked position. If that's the case, be extremely careful not to cause any damage. We're going to use the bracket that typically holds the fuel lines down to the fuel injector unit and start on each of those 2 nuts. You don't need to tighten them up, but you do want to make sure they're on at least a couple good threads. Now with the bracket on here, we're going to carefully try prying up on this to lock the fuel injector unit into the upper intake housing. Now what you're going to find is it only comes up so far. The rubber gasket's going to make its way up along here. Once you feel as though it's up as far as it can go, we'll continue on with our mounting hardware making its way around. Now that we have that fuel injector in place in the upper cover here, let's continue on to the throttle body. For the throttle body, we want to make sure we have it in the proper positioning. We'll carefully rest this down onto the intake cover there and continue on along the 2 forward studs. Those are the longer studs here. Go ahead and start each of these in by hand. We are not tightening anything until we have every piece of the mounting hardware started in the proper position. Let's make our way to the rear throttle body stud. Start that right in there. Let's get this shorter stud in along here. As we make our way towards the rear, on the passenger side, let's make sure that we reinstall our evap solenoid. Press that down on there as far as possible. We'll continue on with our mounting studs here. Continue making your way along the rear of the intake cover. We've got that one in. Let's make our way towards the driver's side rear here. Just starting these in by hand like I mentioned. Let's continue making our way forward along the driver's side now, starting from the rear corner there. Now we can get the forward mounting bolt in for the driver's side here. With each of these started in, we'll bottom them out. The torque for these is 80 inch-pounds. Go around first, bottom them out lightly, then we'll torque them down. All right, let's torque them. As for the center mounting stud here, for the throttle body, holding it down to the upper intake, you want to torque this to 89 inch-pounds. Nice. Now we can remove the mounting nuts for the bracket for the fuel injector. You may already have these off of there. We'll set that bracket aside temporarily. It's time to reinstall the lines leading to this area. We'll take each of the lines, slide them into the corresponding hole, and then continue on with the bracket and the two mounting nuts. As for the mounting nuts, you want to start them on, snug them up, and then torque those to 27 inch-pounds. Reinstall the bracket, slide that right on there. Okay, torque these to 27 inch-pounds. Double check to make sure your fuel lines are completely secured. If it feels like they can move around even a little bit, you could potentially have a fuel leak, and that's extremely dangerous. Take your time, inspect the area, confirm that it is properly secured. Following those fuel lines, we need to make sure that we resecure the bracket, holding it down to the engine. You may have to carefully maneuver the fuel lines around just enough that you can align the mounting bolt hole. Go ahead and start that in and snug it up. You want to make sure it's nice and tight so the lines don't vibrate and loosen up. Right there is bottomed out. Just make sure that's nice and tight. At this point, the fuel system's closed. We'll finish evacuating all the fuel smell from in the air and turn off the ventilation. Now we can move from those fuel lines, and we'll continue on with installing the hose that comes up along this area. This is the one that when I had removed it, I realized that it needed a clamp, so I'm just going to replace that now. Definitely want to make sure you have a good seal on this. Typically, you just want to take that hose, put it in the proper position, and take the clamp, slide it on there, and release pressure. I'm going to be tightening this with my 1/4 inch ratchet because that's the type of clamp I'm using. Where it needs to be. When you do install the clamp, you want to make sure you can see hose on both sides of the clamp. This is extremely important. Okay. Double check to make sure that's completely secured in place. Now it's time for the PCV valve. We have the valve itself, which will slide down into the port of the driver's side valve cover. Now we'll follow the other end. That leads up to this port right here. Slide it down, listen for a click, make sure each end is properly secured. Let's continue on to the wiring harness bracket. This bracket itself will sit onto the studs that are right along the top of the upper intake cover. Once you have that in place, continue on with your two 10mm headed mounting nuts. Start them on, snug them up. There's that one. Double check that bracket. We want to ensure that it is properly secured. And now we'll continue on with the wiring harness up along the top of the fuel injector. For this, you want to make sure that you align it, press it down, listen for a click from the locking tabs, and then lock it in with that gray lock. We'll just double check along each side here to ensure that it's properly locked down. We don't want to have a running condition. Slide in the lock. Double check to make sure everything's secured properly. Now let's move towards the throttle body. We have a couple more wiring harnesses here. Go ahead and align those and press them in. You can't mix them up. They only fit one way. Moving from that side of the throttle body, we're going to continue on with our two brackets and our throttle cable. Let's start with the throttle cable and the throttle cable bracket. We're going to have to put the cable in place along this portion here. Now it's going to have to slide through from the outside straight towards the center, and then the rest of the cable is going to make its way through that groove. Carefully reach inside this area. We'll pivot it as needed, and we can install that cable. Like I said, coming from the outside, sliding it through towards that groove. Just press it right on in. You can see it right in there. Now I'll take the rest of the cable. Release that throttle body. A quick confirmation here. We need to ensure that it's properly seated. If it's off, it's going to cause an issue. Now let's continue on with the throttle cable bracket. We'll be taking this and slide it right down on place. At this point, there should be a stud that we'll be using. We'll use that right across the front here. We can maneuver this around as needed. Now that we have that started in, let's start on the rest of the mounting hardware. We've got our two mounting nuts. Get the one close to the coil there. Snug them up. Take hold of the bracket, ensure that it's properly secured. We'll continue on to the next bracket. For this one, it only slides over the two studs. You have the forward stud that we just installed, and then you have this one on the other side of the throttle body. Align it, get it in position, and start on those mounting nuts. After that, you can snug them up. Now let's move to our next bracket. This one's along the rear passenger side. We need to get this bracket in place and start on the mounting nut. Okay, it's bottomed out. Just make sure that's snug. We've got our two electrical connectors in this area. Once again, you really can't mix them up. Double check each of these to ensure that they are properly secured. Let's make our way back here. We'll secure our wiring harness. Now let's focus on the distributor. We need to replace the gasket that goes between the distributor base and the intake itself. We'll carefully slide this out of position. A quick comparison to the brand new one. Set the original aside and continue on with the installation of your new gasket. We'll take this and slide it all the way up against the base of the distributor. Perfect. Now we can prepare to install our distributor. When we go to do so, we need to pay attention to our markings. You remember along the top, we have the distributor rotor, which can rotate. We made a marking where it needs to end up, and we also made a marking where it had stopped as we had lifted it up. It's important to note that you have to start at that position as when we had lifted it up. If you're turned even one tooth to the wrong direction, it's going to cause an issue. When you go to fully install this and the mounting bolt is fully aligned, if it looks like your marking's off, like I said, even that far, you're going to have a running condition and your vehicle may not even start. Take your time. Here we go. Now as we come down, I'm making sure that I align that rotor. This is extremely important. At the same time as I'm aligning the rotor, I'm also trying to eyeball the base there. Like I said, if we're off by a tiny bit, it can make a huge difference. Take your time. Okay, let's continue pressing this down. Align the mounting bolt hole. And now a thorough inspection. We need to ensure that we are aligned. I've said this a couple times. One last time. Make sure you're aligned. If you are not, continue on by lifting up on the distributor, turn that rotor one direction or the other a tiny bit, and continue on sliding it down into the proper position. Ensure that you're aligned, and then you can continue with that mounting hardware down along the bottom. Now that we've confirmed that we are properly aligned, we'll continue on with our 10mm headed mounting bolt. Go ahead and take this and start it in position. Snug it up, confirm that you are still aligned, and then torque that down to 18 foot-pounds. Now we can torque this. The torque is 18 foot-pounds. That converts to 216 inch-pounds. We'll just get our inch-pound wrench in here. Now that we have that mounted, let's make our way to that electrical connector. Press it in, listen for a click. Go ahead and give it a little tug to make sure it's completely secured in place. It's time to install the distributor cap. We'll make sure we have it in the proper positioning so we have the area with the 4 plug wires facing towards the passenger side of the vehicle. We'll get it in position, align our mounting bolt holes, and start in each of those 2 small mounting bolts. Careful not to drop these along the back side of the engine. That can be problematic. We'll use a T20 Torx bit to snug these up, and then we can torque them to 21 inch-pounds. It's not very much. There we are. Now it's time for the spark plug wires. We'll start with the coil wire, which is around the center of the engine here. Go ahead and take this and bring it down along the side of the engine, underneath the bracket, and all the way to the back prong on the passenger side of the distributor cap. Slide this right back there. When you go to install these, it's a good idea to use a tiny bit of dielectric lubricant. We'll just slide this right on there. Double check to make sure it's completely seated up against the base. We'll give it a light wiggle to ensure that it is properly secured and continue on with the rest of our spark plug wires. Starting with the front spark plug wire on the passenger side. We'll follow that wire. Confirm we have the proper wire. Now for the passenger side, this forward wire will be on the forward prong on the distributor cap, the forward port. Once again, pressing it on, a quick wiggle. Continue on down along the passenger side. The center spark plug wire will go to the center port, and the rearward wire will go to the rearward port that's just forward of the coil wire. Got my third wire. We'll just confirm everything is secured on the passenger side of the distributor cap. Now we'll make our way to the driver's side. You're going to have to pay attention to the wiring sequence. For the passenger side, starting with the forward spark plug wire, this time the spark plug wire will go on the center port on the driver's side of the distributor cap. We'll press that in. The middle wire will go on the forward port. And now the rear spark plug wire goes on the rear port on the driver's side of the distributor cap. One last confirmation while we're back here to ensure everything is properly installed. This looks perfect. Now we can install the fan shroud. Before we start bringing it down into position, if you were to look along the rear of the radiator, you'll find that it does have two tabs that protrude out. They're small hooks. We'll take this shroud and gently rest it down into those hooked areas. As we bring this down, you want to be extremely careful not to cause any damage to the radiator. Pay attention to those hooked areas. Continuing on to the upper fan shroud, we'll just rest this one in position along the bottom. You should find that on each side it does have an alignment tab that will fit up through this corresponding hole. As long as it's aligned as it should be, you should be able to install each of your push clips, 2 along each side of the fan shroud. Same on the other side. Now we'll continue on to our 2 10mm headed mounting bolts up along the top. Start them in, snug them up. Right there is bottomed out. We'll just make sure it's snug. Confirm the fan shroud is properly secured to the vehicle. Now it's time for the air intake. When you go to put this in position, along the bottom of the air intake, you'll find that you have a hooked area that needs to fit around the forward edge of the throttle body. Once it has, we'll roll this down and align the mounting point. With it in place, we'll snug it up with that wing nut in the center. Make sure that's nice and tight. Let's get this in place. Now we can install the rest of our intake. Let's get this in position. There we are, tight fit. Let's pause there, make our way to the other end. This portion will make its way to the upper air filter housing. You want to make sure that this aligns as you continue pressing it in. You may have to try to twist things as needed. There we are. Once you feel as though you have it bottomed out, continue on with tightening each one of those 2 clamps with your 8mm. Confirm each of them are tight. You don't want any dirty or unmetered air making its way into the engine. Let's reconnect in our mass airflow sensor. Once you do press this into position, lock it in with your gray locking tab. I got a nice click from that. We'll give it a tug, lock it down. Now it's time to fill the cooling system. I'll be using a funnel to help me direct this directly into this area without spilling any. When we're filling this, we need to make sure that we're paying attention along the side here. The inboard side is going to have a small chart letting us know exactly how full our system needs to be. We'll start by topping off the fluid up to this point. After that, you need to run the vehicle for a while, let it get up to normal operating temperature, and continue checking the fluid level. Top it off as necessary. We'll use the manufacturer's specified fluid, and of course you do want to make sure that it's 50-50 mixed, not concentrated. Okay, we've got the fluid up to this point. We're going to make sure that we remove the funnel, install the cap, and then we'll run the vehicle, as I mentioned, getting it up to normal operating temperature. Once it is, we'll confirm that we're up to the proper level. Reconnect your negative battery terminal. Start it in, snug it up with your 8mm. Double check to make sure it's completely secured. Okay friend, when you go to start the engine, you may find that it takes a couple extra cranks to be able to start the engine. That's due to the fact we have to build fuel pressure back up in the system. Aside from that, once it does run, you want to make sure you have it running up to normal operating temperature. While doing so, check for leaks, check the coolant level of course, and then once everything's nice and warm, you want to make sure that you check the timing of your engine to ensure everything's functioning properly. Aside from that, thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.